and welcome to Gods and Movie Makers, otherwise known as Tolkien About Religion and Cinema, the show about how religion and the Bible shape the stories we tell on screen. I'm Joe Scales.
And I'm Katie Turner.
On this season, The Chosen One. Why were they chosen? Do they want to be chosen? And why are we so attracted to these sorts of stories? We'll be talking about The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring today with Dr. Marion Kelsey. Marion is a Hebrew Bible scholar at the University of Nottingham, specialising in biblical narrative, allusions and scriptural reuse. She is particularly interested in how biblical narratives have been interpreted and retold in art, literature and music in the centuries after they were written. And her work includes looking at this reception in sci-fi and fantasy novels. Marion has recently published on interlocking allusions in Jonah and Ruth and prophetic protest in relation to modern protest movements. Welcome, Marion.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
Okay, so our kick-off question for you, Marion. If you could add one mythical creature to our natural world, be it Ents, dragons, fairies, hippogriffs, unicorns, anything like that, what mythical creature would you wish into existence?
The Loch Ness Monster.
Oh, nice. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
Good old Nessie.
Just I feel like it should exist.
I like that because it would be just the one.
Yeah.
Like the other options, you would add a whole species, but you've picked just one.
Mm. And she's got somewhere to live as well.
Yeah. Wouldn't disrupt any habitats because, she's already there.
So, thinking about The Fellowship of the Ring, what's your prior relationship with the film and the book, maybe, and have you done any work on them?
I've not done any work on them. I have, of course, watched them many, many times. And I've read the books a few times. First, when I was really quite young, too young to absorb or remember anything from it much. And then watched the films, and then came back to the books and really, really enjoyed reading them in light of the film, with the experience of the film behind me, because I already knew the broad outline of the plot, and so I could just enjoy the journey a lot more that you had so much more of in the books, because you had more there, longer, more detail, more events, and I could kind of sit back and enjoy it rather than just thinking, what's going to happen?
That feels like the perfect segue into our film synopsis, so let's get into it.
Legend tells of a ring created by an ancient evil that gave its wearer the power to enslave the world. Believed lost for centuries, it has now been found.
Is it secret? Is it safe?
The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring is a 2001 fantasy adventure film. It's the first installment in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, directed by Peter Jackson and based on the novels by JRR Tolkien. Set in the fictional continent of Middle-earth, the story revolves around the Dark Lord Sauron, who seeks the One Ring, which contains part of his soul. He needs the ring in order to return to power, but it has found its way to the young hobbit Frodo Baggins via his uncle Bilbo. The fate of Middle-earth hangs in the balance as Frodo and 8 companions, who form the Fellowship of the Ring, begin their journey to Mount Doom in the land of Mordor to destroy the ring and Sauron in the process. The ensemble cast, including Ian McKellen, Elijah Wood, Viggo Mortensen, Christopher Lee, Ian Holm, Sean Bean, Sean Astin, Cate Blanchett, and more, is spectacular, and the breathtaking landscape of New Zealand, where it was filmed, is almost a character in its own right. The whole thing has a beautiful medieval aesthetic fed through an Art Deco and Art Nouveau lens, and is an eminently rewatchable masterclass in filmcraft. Yeah, so I've been so excited to talk about this film because I think that Frodo is the prototypical chosen one. And given that our season is the chosen one, we had to talk about Frodo. He hits all the themic, tropic things for chosen ones. He has a common existence before he's chosen. He finds out through being chosen that that there's something special about him, a quality that's important. He has somebody who teaches him and guides him in the figure of Gandalf, played by Ian McKellen, and I think also probably Aragorn, played by Viggo Mortensen. Gandalf is a wizard, and Aragorn is heir to, like, the kingdom of Middle-earth. And he has helpers. And most important for Frodo is Samwise Gamgee, who Frodo would not be able to complete his mission. I feel like I've just summed everything up, but let's get into this. Frodo is chosen one.
Well, this is perhaps a good moment to ask. So what did you think we were asking initially when we approached you with this film, my dear Marion?
When I heard that the theme was the chosen one, the person who immediately jumped into my mind was actually Aragorn as the chosen king, the long lost heir to the throne, that sort of thing. And so when you then said we're concentrating only on the Fellowship of the Ring, I was a bit like, oh, how does that work? And it was much later that I realised, oh, no, this is Frodo that we're talking about. I think this is perhaps another difference between the film and the book. Within the film, he is not the most interesting character, I think quite deliberately. In the book, he does have a bit more complexity and depth. And that is, in a way, precisely what makes him special, what makes him the chosen one, as you have defined it. But it just meant that my mind didn't immediately go there when I first heard the theme.
I agree with you about Frodo in the movies. I think even though he hits all of these things that we've outlined that are kind of not always there for chosen one figures, but very frequently there for chosen one figures, he's not very interesting. He's a little bit, you kind of wonder, like, why him? Why Frodo specifically? Because Sam doesn't seem bothered by the ring or desire for the ring, yes. And Sam seems to, in a lot of places, demonstrate more courage or forthrightness or even just quick-wittedness. Bilbo, yes, he has some attachment to the ring, but that's because he's had it for 60 years, and he's actually able to give it up pretty easily. Yeah, and it was only in sort of reading about where the film diverges from the book that I found out Frodo's much more complex of a character in the books and actually has moments of courage and aspects to him that make him like a more well-rounded character.
It's interesting having watched The Fellowship in isolation, which is something I never really do. Frodo, obviously, when it is just him and Sam and eventually Gollum Smeagol, it feels like he's got a bit more characterization to do, and the ring is clearly almost literally tearing him apart. He's developing these two sides to who he is, at least from the Fellowship, to race through these story beats. It's interesting in some ways. Like, for me, I was thinking his chosen oneness almost, he's maybe this going too far, but he's got some perhaps self-awareness that he's got a really important task to do. But for Frodo, that ends at Rivendell.
Yes.
That's the end. He's had his adventure, and this is very much the text in the book, but it's obviously so much more than that. So I think that's a really interesting thing. He's just put through this trial in many ways and is swept up by things that he can't really get a handle on. And particularly when Gandalf dies, I think that's a real significant moment in Frodo's arc, because it just seems as though he's broken beyond that point.
Yes. Yeah, there's no going back from there to the life he once had, whereas at Rivendell he could still more or less have gone back, apart from his wound. And also I think a big difference between the first and then the subsequent two movies is that when Frodo, Sam and Gollum going off on their own adventures, Frodo is very clearly the leader of that little trio. In the Fellowship of the Ring, he's almost baggage, sometimes literally baggage, carried along by all of the other passengers on the way. His only job is to wear the ring, while Aragorn and Boromir and everyone else bundles him along the route. And so that marks a real change in Frodo's role as well between the first and then the subsequent two films.
I do think we get sort of a hint of why Frodo in that initial meeting in Rivendell. So from the start of the film, when Frodo is first given the ring, basically by Bilbo, and tasked with carrying it by Gandalf, and Gandalf lets Frodo know what this ring is, the importance of this ring, and they set out to Rivendell. And as you said, Frodo thinks, like, that's it, that's the big journey, and then he'll be done and he'll go home. And then he witnesses all of these people. We have elves and dwarves and men and the hobbits, and they're all bickering over what to do and who should take the ring and what should happen with the ring. And Frodo is just watching and then he steps up and says that he'll take it to Mordor. And I think that, even though we don't get a lot of the other aspects of his character that are in the books and the movies, that's the main thing, I think, in this film that you're supposed to focus on. The thing that makes him different, that hobbits are little and he's with all these bigger people. I think they're bigger in character as well as in actual stature. But he puts himself forward.
And then the other hobbits follow suit, and they've all got varying degrees of awareness of what's going on. So Frodo's line is I don't know the way. It is such a mark of his innocence in many ways. Earlier we've had Boromir talk about what Mordor is like. He's been on the front lines of the fight against Sauron for probably his whole life. He's very acutely aware of the danger they're going into and seems to be a voice of opposition to many of the things that the council was trying to decide. But I think that's coming from a place of, they're sitting in Rivendell, looks pretty idyllic. We'll get to Gondor in the later films, and a lot of it really isn't. It's kind of in ruins. And it's interesting that the hobbits are the ones who have this bravery and innocence in many ways. And immediately it's a great scene, but they all just pile on.
I think I like also that all the characters in this are complex. It is ultimately a story of good versus evil, but we don't have a really clear-cut good versus evil in terms of the characters. So obviously Sauron is evil, but apart from that, every character has multiple levels to who they are, and we see a lot of weakness of varying degrees. So I think we see more weakness among some of the characters who are more tempted into evil than we do among the characters who stay on the side that we would label as good. But even there, it shifts around. So I think there's a real kind of honesty to that. We don't have a simplistic characterization.
Alison Milbank, on writing about Tolkien as a theologian, has this kind of interesting idea of Tolkien thinking of evil as Augustinian, in the sense that evil isn't really a thing in itself, it's an absence of good. And what we see in the evil characters is that they are depersonalized and dehumanized to the extent where the ultimate big bad in the Lord of the Rings saga is Sauron, and he's just an eye. Same with the Ringwraiths, the Nazgul. They are just vessels of men that their desire for power has led them down this kind of depersonalized route. I think Gollum as well is quite a broken figure, and really he clings on to life, but there's nothing beyond his fixation there. So there's this really interesting portrayal of evil as often self-defeating. It's Sauron's arrogance that causes him to overlook the threat that hobbits could be, and there's a large part that he can't even conceive that his enemies would not use the ring. There's a whole lot of evil as a self-destructive tendency, but not rather than an active, personalized being.
Riffing off of that and the appeal to the theology behind the complexity of the characters. In a letter to a priest friend in 1953, Tolkien wrote, "The Lord of the Rings is of course a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, unconsciously so at first, but consciously in the revision. That is why I have not put in or have cut out practically all references to anything like religion, to cults or practices in the imaginary world, for the religious element is absorbed into the story and the symbolism." So it's religious without religion, it's Catholic but without visual practice or expression of belief. How should we understand Tolkien's explanation of his work? Where is religion in the Fellowship of the Ring?
For me, coming from a Hebrew Bible perspective, I saw much more of the Hebrew Bible in it, both in similarity and contrast. I've not thought of it as Catholic before, but I find that a very interesting idea. I think Catholicism strip away the semblances of religion, and Catholicism approaches life with a fundamentally communal view of humanity and humanity's role in the world. You are part of the church, and you might not have faith, but that's okay so long as you go along to Mass every Sunday and somebody else in the congregation has faith. Whereas Protestantism is extremely individualistic in its approach to humanity's progress, individual humans' progress through the world. And I think especially in the Fellowship of the Ring, but all the way through the trilogy, nobody gets anywhere by themselves in Lord of the Rings. They don't achieve anything by themselves in Lord of the Rings. Everyone depends on others. And you depend on others' strengths, and you depend on others' weaknesses, like Gollum playing a vital role, even though he's corrupted by the ring. And that feels more Catholic to me. And so I see where that is coming from.
I think if I was going to find one sort of biblical theme in it, it would be the idea of the fall.
Yes,
because we have Isildur and the race of men who have erred by failing to destroy the ring. That's sort of like the pre-setup for, and it happens thousands of years before the action at the start of the Fellowship of the Ring. And so there's a longing for a return to the state of things before that moment. And we do get that restoration at the end of Return of the King, which is the third film or the third book. But that sort of failure of men is present. I think it's really strong in the Fellowship. Like Aragorn is really, he doesn't trust in himself because men are fallible. Boromir ends up representing the fallibility of men.
But look how Boromir dies. You know, he has this deathbed conversion, and Aragorn ultimately succeeds in resisting the power of the ring.
Quick editorial insert on the fall. The fall refers to Christian readings of Genesis 3, wherein Adam and Eve disobey God's instruction and are cast out of the Garden of Eden. Since Augustine, this has been a central part of Christian anthropology and the root of evil entering the world and many other kinds of things. But this is a specific reading rooted in historical Christianity. Back to the interview.
I think this might be where the kind of the Catholicism comes in, because I think Catholics are more basically optimistic about human nature than Protestants tend to be. And that is with the fall, you know, granted the fall, and yet optimistic about human nature. I don't think the fall prevents you being optimistic about where humankind will end up. And in particular, this is also a major difference between Christian views and the Hebrew Bible in itself. It's just not really a fall in the Hebrew Bible. It's not this absolute schism between the pre-lapsarian state and what happens afterwards. It's just not that big a deal. It's just one example of many examples of humanity constantly trying to be like God.
That's why in Jewish thought there is no fall.
Yeah.
That's not a thing in Judaism. That's just Christianity.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And I wonder whether some of that is there in Tolkien, in the sense that things can go wrong, but that doesn't mean they can't be put right. And I think, I mean, when I was watching the Fellowship of the Ring last night, of course the ring is this corrupting power, and it can distort almost anyone. But just watching it and going through the number of people who resist temptation, you just keep ticking them off. And so it's not nearly as ultimately corrupting as the mythology within the novels presents it as. If you take just this one little snapshot of history in the history of Middle-earth, and you have, like half a dozen people who are able to resist the power of the ring, you know, that's quite a heavy concentration. And they all happen to be in the crucial place at the right time, and who knows, maybe lots of other people around would have been able to resist it as well. And it doesn't seem to be that pessimistic.
So I'm thinking of the key character in The Lord of the Rings who does become almost totally corrupted over the course of several hundred years is Gollum. But Gollum immediately upon finding the ring kills his cousin for it. Yeah. So you're kind of like, well, how kind of good was he before that? It's like he's had it for moments and he kills for it. But even then, Gandalf doesn't see him as beyond redemption, and neither does Frodo.
Eventually.
And there's this kind of like, even that very, very tragic figure of Gollum isn't entirely beyond redemption, I think, in the world of Lord of the Rings, which is a very interesting kind of thing. Again, coming back to this idea of what evil is in Lord of the Rings. So if we're talking about Hebrew Bible and Lord of the Rings, you had some ideas for kind of parallels between them.
Yeah.
Do you want to get
so
into some
many
of those? Because
parallels.
I found these particularly interesting when you were kind of mentioning to me.
So I didn't find one thing that I really enjoyed about watching Lord of the Rings is that you don't find a blatant retelling of biblical stories in Lord of the Rings. It's never as full as an entire narrative. It's always bits and pieces. And those bits and pieces don't necessarily overlap in a large, coherent arc. And so it's much more elusive than it is retelling. And I think obviously the Shire can come across as a kind of Edenic space where there's an abundance of everything without too much toil and effort. And Frodo within the Shire, right at the start of the film, Frodo is very curious about the world outside. He wants to know about the world outside, but you have Bilbo saying at some point in his heart, Frodo is still in love with the Shire. He's not ready to leave. He thinks he is, but he isn't. He's not quite ready to leave. And I think that does mirror Adam and Eve within Eden and their desire for knowledge, their reaching out for knowledge, but at a stage of immaturity almost. They don't understand, because they can't possibly understand, they haven't been told what the full consequences of this would be. And I think also there's a bit of an overlap there with Frodo kind of chastising Gandalf for turning Bilbo and the Bagginses into this disreputable family. And Gandalf says, I don't know what you mean. All I did was give him a push out the door. And I think the serpent is very demonized in a lot of, especially Christian, readings of the Eden story. Everything the serpent says is true. The serpent says, if you eat from this fruit, you will become like God, knowing good and evil. And then they go and eat the fruit. And at the end of that chapter, God says, oh no, what's happened? They have become like us, knowing good and evil. You know, the serpent gives the truth to Adam and Eve, just in a particularly shaped way. And so I was quite amused by the idea that Gandalf was a kind of serpent figure. With chosen one figures in various other texts, quite often you have chosen ones growing into their role, which Frodo does to some degree. But throughout the whole Lord of the Rings arc, the emphasis in Frodo's story is on his loss, what he loses. He can never go back, he's never the same. And especially in the final scenes, you get the idea that he's actually worse off than if none of this had ever happened. And I think that had a certain amount of parallel with several of the biblical prophets, Jeremiah most of all, for whom being chosen wasn't some grand calling. It was a kind of curse that ruined their life, and yet they had no choice but to complete their mission. And so there was that. And then I think perhaps one of the most complicated set of overlaps, allusions, apart from the whole Eden thing, is with the ring as a kind of kingship and the various ring bearers as kingly figures, royal figures within the books of Samuel and Kings. And the Hebrew Bible, for all that God eventually agrees that the Israelites can have a king, it's a very reluctant agreement. And the Hebrew Bible is always deeply suspicious of the notion of human kingship, and especially the corrupting possibilities from it, because really God is the only king and the only person you should have as king, and why aren't you happy with that? But no, they want a king like all of the other nations, and so eventually God gives them a king. And the first king is, of course, Saul. Saul initially didn't want to be king. He went and tried to hide amongst all the bags. He didn't want to be king, but then he was made king, and then slowly driven mad by this kingship, and especially by the dread of his kingship being taken away, by his paranoia about that power being taken from him towards the end of his life. And that seemed very like a kind of Gollum figure, where when he first gets the ring, he's a relatively normal person of the river folk, and then gradually over hundreds of years gets completely corrupted by this gift of the ring. And then that makes Frodo, the true chosen one, the true king, parallel David, who is God's chosen king, one after God's own heart, And it all seems very positive. Surely he is going to be one good figure that we have in the Hebrew Bible. Here's at least one of them. But then, of course, once he becomes king, that corrupting effect also works on him, ultimately with the Bathsheba story, where he's no longer out fighting the battles for God. He's at home in his palace while his army goes off and fights the battles. And because he happens to be there, whereas he should be on the front line, he sees Bathsheba bathing, he has her husband murdered. This is kind of David's ultimate downfall. And from then on, everything goes downhill for David. And yeah, it just gets worse and worse from then on for David, even though he dies not in absolute wickedness or anything like that, but he just stumbles over and over again from then on. He does things over and over again wrong with the census and everything, and he dies a broken figure. And that, I think, overlaps a bit with Frodo, who starts off as quite a pure character, and then the ring gradually does corrupt him. And even though he doesn't commit the ultimate crime of holding on to it and seeing the world fall to ruins around him, he can't undo what he did and who he was while he still had the ring and wanted to keep it. And he ends up as this broken character.
And even saying that, he does actually, in the book and in the films, struggle to keep the ring to himself. And it's only because Gollum struggles harder that doesn't happen.
I mean, he doesn't throw the ring into the fire. He doesn't. Gollum bites his finger off and falls. And so it's not...
Yeah, this was one of the sort of... I read a couple articles to prep for this. I was looking for people who had written on the religious imagery in The Lord of the Rings. And I read quite a few that tried to argue that Frodo is a Christ figure because he carries the sins of the world on him. And I kept thinking, Frodo fails in the end. He
does. Yeah.
Gollum has to dispose of the ring, not intentionally so, but yeah, he doesn't. I mean, Frodo does not succeed, so he doesn't make a very good Christ figure.
He's really not a Christ figure. I hate that idea.
I thought it was a terrible reading.
It's awful.
But so many people offer this as a reading, and I think it's a desire to wedge a really literal Christianity into the Lord of the Rings. And Tolkien, I think, in his own writings, talked about how he resisted that. He was not, on purpose, was not making a literal mapping on of some figures onto others.
Yeah.
But I think, Joe, you thought that the David figure was Aragorn, or possibly Isildur. Yeah. And then that would make Aragorn the sort of the king to come.
Yeah, I mean... It's kind of quite literal, right? So they're both kings. They're both kind of messianic in some ways. There's sayings about the king who will restore Gondor, like one who... There's, I think they're drawn from kennings, like this kind of English, Anglo-Saxon literature kind of things where they're like riddle sayings that don't really make sense, but you work them out. And Tolkien almost uses them as prophetic kind of things that come true, and he also used them just as straight up riddles, so the hobbits love them, and as does Smeagol. So one of these kind of sayings about the king that comes to Gondor is something about healing with his hands, even though his hands are empty. He's got that role about him.
Aragorn definitely works as messianic, yeah. And yeah, I would say messianic, not Davidic, for this sort of reason, that David's reign ends in failure and he's lying in his bed with a concubine to warm him and he can't even get it up to, that's implied that he's completely powerless at the end of his life, politically and personally. Whereas the messianic prophecies, of course, in their vague allusions to this, that and the other, that absolutely seems to map onto kennings and the Hobbit sayings, and what Aragorn ultimately seems to fulfill with his reign. And so, yeah, I think Aragorn as messianic works very nicely.
I do also briefly want to just raise Boromir, because I do feel he's underserved in the film a little bit. Very much. I watched the extended edition for this, as I always do, and it's been a while since I watched the theatrical cut. But Marion, you watched the theatrical cut for this.
They're so unfair to Boromir. when I went back to the books after I'd watched the films and read about the character, he was one of my favourite characters in the books. He was such a wonderful man in the books. Very brave, very, in some ways, quite uncomplicated in his bravery and his duty and his loyalty, putting his life on the line for the others and all that sort of thing. And they wash so much of that out, especially in the theatrical release of the films. Perhaps necessarily, there's no just time limits. But I was very sorry to see it happen, because he's a much better, nicer, more rounded sort of character in the books. And his end is like this madness that falls upon him, rather than this thing that he'd been plotting the whole way through, which is at least implied in the films. I don't know who he would be, biblically speaking.
But it seems, I think he gets
Perhaps
a little bit...
Jonathan.
Maybe,
oh,
yeah.
Definitely Jonathan. Yes,
Yeah?
of course, with the tragic end and everything. Yeah, he would very much be Jonathan. Yeah.
There we are, we've nailed that.
Well done, guys.
Yeah.
Boromir is kind of the representative in some ways of just the regular person.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately he gets a lot of that, then the real corrupting power of the ring.
Mm-hmm.
And even then, I still feel he kind of serves an important purpose, because it also seemed that Aragorn leading the Fellowship after they've lost Gandalf really just has no idea what he's doing. The impetus for Frodo to, I think he's already kind of largely made up his mind that he has to abandon the Fellowship. And Boromir is that final impetus. So I think Frodo had been planning to do it almost immediately after that anyway. Mm. So it's this kind of almost like a Judas figure in some sense, where you read Judas very, very charitably, like the Last Temptation of Christ, where Judas has to do what he does. So Frodo goes off and completes his mission. But again, there's all these other people who are so responsible for ensuring that this quest to destroy the ring happens.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So there's so much supporting cast that's going on.
And I was just thinking of Boromir actually in the through the lens of the Chosen One as an ordinary figure called to an extraordinary mission, something like that. And if Frodo is an example of that when it goes well, perhaps Boromir is an example of that when it does not. And a necessary contrast, because otherwise the Chosen One would not be an ordinary figure. If it was preordained that they were always going to succeed, it wouldn't work as a trope. It wouldn't work as an idea. We have to see that it can fail in order to celebrate when it succeeds. And I think Boromir's failure as just a completely ordinary person who cannot go to extraordinary lengths does that for us. And it's not a character failing, which I feel like it is presented as in the films, but within the books there's no sense of this as a character failing. Boromir is a very good person. It's just that this is what the ring does. It casts its madness over you.
Yeah, see, I read it that way in the films, that he is ultimately a good person, and he's just corrupted by the ring. So maybe because you have even more richness to his character from the books, you see the film not doing that, but I definitely got that from the film.
Yeah, good. Yeah.
And I really appreciate your point about if you're preordained to succeed, then you don't have this chosen oneness, because in setting up this season, Joe and I had a long discussion about, is a chosen one the same as a savior figure? And I really think that there's a lot of overlap, but ultimately they are not the same. And the savior figure is ordained. They're always going to succeed. That is the thing. Whereas a chosen one, because it's this quality of ordinariness to moving to extraordinariness, that we can all sort of map ourselves onto that adventure or to the challenge or to whatever it is and think, would we also be able to succeed if we were chosen? Where you can't have that sort of relationship with the savior figure.
I think this is perhaps a good juncture to start to talk about the lived experience of Tolkien and war.
Yeah, I think what we're getting with each of these characters, the way that each of them sort of handle the presentation of the ring and varying degrees of being tempted and resisting that temptation. And I think Tolkien does a really good job of demonstrating that through the Fellowship. One of the other things that you said about Frodo that he's changed by being chosen.
Mm-hmm.
And you related that to Jeremiah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I see that as the most World War I thing in this story, that Frodo is the shell-shocked veteran returning from war.
Mm-hmm.
Tolkien was profoundly affected by his experience on the battlefield of World War I and the loss of nearly all of his closest friends to the war. And he had insisted repeatedly throughout his later life that, and this is a quote from him, neither World War nor the atomic bomb had any influence upon either the plot or the manner of its unfolding. The impact and character of the wars, particularly the First World War, was noted by readers almost immediately when reading The Lord of the Rings. And 2 days after the third book was published, C.S. Lewis wrote that the wars over the ring in the books have the very quality of the war my generation knew. So a lot of people were seeing these themes, even as Tolkien was resisting that the themes were present. For what it's worth, Tolkien did admit in personal correspondence that the war was perhaps, that's his word, perhaps, present in the landscape. And specifically, he points to the dead marshes, which we see in the second film, and the approaches to Morannon, which is the entrance to Mordor, that they may owe something to northern France in the Battle of the Somme. So I had always thought that the echoes of World War I were really quite intentional because it seemed really obvious to me in a few key ways, and we can come back to that. But it surprised me to read that Tolkien rather insistently minimized that. But in order to understand Tolkien's own experience better and to help us talk through all of this a bit, basically where and how we might see the First World War in The Lord of the Rings, I spoke to Dr. James Connolly, who's a historian of the First World War at University College London, and he explained to me that the Battle of the Somme in which Tolkien fought was a nearly failed attempt to break through the German lines. It lasted a full 6 months, and it resulted in a phenomenal loss of life. And I have here that will insert the clip of what James said. So, James, could you explain what the Battle of the Somme was like?
So what it was a very important battle for the British in the First World War, but also the French and obviously the Germans. It was an attempt to break through German lines, which didn't do that well. It ended up being a battle that lasted from July to November 1916, so an extremely long battle, although really it's kind of an umbrella term for a series of other battles. It involved a lot of artillery, particularly in the week before, 1.5 million shells being bombarded against the German lines. But it didn't actually properly work, and the barbed wire wasn't broken, the German line wasn't broken, and therefore it was an extremely bloody battle.
So about how many lives were lost? What sort of loss of life, I suppose, would Tolkien have experienced while he was there?
You're talking about an immense loss of life. I mean, the first day of the Battle of the Somme, the 1st of July, 1916, 57,000 casualties, 20,000 dead. Still to this day, the deadliest day in British military history. And then those casualties continued, not consistently, but continued until the end of the battle, until November. And overall, you're talking about over 1 million dead when you consider all the combatants. So that's the British, the French, and the Germans, about 500,000 Germans, 400-ish thousand British, and 200 to 400,000 French, so extreme loss of life.
What would the environment have been like? I know we're all familiar with the sort of idea of trench warfare being muddy and dirty, but with that many people dying, and I think I've read something that it sort of like existing there was kind of night was day and day was night.
Yeah, so there's a lot of truth to that idea of the kind of muddy battlefields, particularly in the Somme, which is northern France, northeastern France, and the weather's not great either, so particularly during this battle, in the latter part of it, October onwards, there was very heavy rain, so there would have been a lot of mud. And the shell holes, 1.5 million shells being bombarded against the German lines. So the landscape was pockmarked, it was ravaged by shell holes, trees no longer existed, or there were just stumps left, barbed wire is everywhere, but also the dead, that immense number of death, immense amount of death we mentioned. The dead littered the battlefield, as they do in most World War I battlefields, because it's quite difficult and dangerous to get rid of dead bodies. Obviously, you can't do that in the middle of an assault. So this idea of almost lunar landscape, but extremely muddy as well, covered by dead people, the stench of death, rats eating dead bodies, eating live bodies as well, a hellish landscape. This kind of stereotype of the First World War really was true for the Battle of the Somme.
So when we think about the dead marshes in The Lord of the Rings, which is this marshland, and as they start to move through it, they notice that there are bodies all throughout the marshes. So this is sort of what we would have been, or what people who were at the Battle of the Somme would have been experiencing there. So 1 million dead, and a large portion of them just dead on the battlefield for the whole 6-month period.
They wouldn't necessarily be left there for the whole 6 months. You did have people whose job it was to recover bodies if possible. Of course, the problem is you can't always recover bodies in trench warfare, partly because they've been shelled to pieces, partly because of the mud and the rain kind of claims them, as it were. And this means, there were dead bodies the whole time, essentially. Yeah, so you get lots and lots of eyewitness accounts talking about layers of dead bodies, kind of strata of dead bodies piled up on top of each other or with mud on top of them buried. Lots of people refer to seeing fallen comrades or even people they don't know on the battlefield dying or dead and having to pass them because of the nature of an advance. Other times, bodies that are there kind of calcified, rotten, they've been there for a long time or affected by the rain or eaten by rats, so you approach a body and rats explode out of them, this horrific scenario, which is caused by the nature of trench warfare, essentially. You're getting hailed at by machine guns, you're getting attacked by mortars and shells, barbed wire, there are mines potentially. It's very dangerous to get rid of these bodies. So the idea of bodies appearing out of the mud as you move through that mud is very much a World War I experience, and lots of soldiers would have experienced that.
So Tolkien was repeatedly, over the course of his life, I suppose, responding to suggestions that his writing was allegory by saying it's not allegory, it's absolutely not allegory. But from what you're describing, it seems like it'd be really, really hard to actually shed that experience and not put it into your writing. And I feel like Frodo, especially by the time we get to the end, at the very end of The Return of the King, he behaves like somebody with trauma, or what we might have called shell shock.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think Tolkien did admit that the Dead Marshes might be based on the Somme there. But I think it's true to say that whole experience pervades his life, as it did for millions of people who fought in the First World War. Not just with shell shock, but with, not necessarily officially diagnosed shell shock, but obviously an experience shared by many, which is extremely horrific. And how can you forget that, essentially? How can you not be informed by that when you move to your own writing, essentially? And you see this, obviously, in interwar literature as well, interwar film. And also, there is filmic evidence of the Battle of the Somme. There's a film that came out in 1916 called The Battle of the Somme. 1 million people went to see it just in London in its first week. And it was a propaganda film based on actual documentary footage intertwined with the recreations. And so that kind of thing is going to clearly seep into your subconscious. And for the people who read Lord of the Rings and read it afterwards, they may have also been aware of this kind of national trauma on the battlefront.
I kind of don't know what to say. It takes your breath away.
Yeah, it's pretty horrific.
Yeah.
At the time, it was seen, to some extent, in the way we now conceive of the Second World War. It was, although we tend to think of it as this imperial war pitting different people against each other who obviously had no say in this, that is true, particularly when it comes to colonial warfare as well. But at the same time, people really believed in the causes that they fought for. They really fought for something ideological in one sense. And that's actually something that French historians in particular touch upon, this idea of war culture. There's a way people understand the war through representations, even through film, through literature, through song, a system of representations to make them understand the war and demonize the enemy that allows you to actually kill or to accept killing and death on a mass scale, that we tend to forget. It was an ideological war. It was good versus evil. And both sides obviously thought they were in the right. So there is an ideological underpinning to this that we tend to forget today when we just see it as purely like a war of resources or imperial cousins getting annoyed at each other and sending off their armies. There's more to it than that.
Thanks. I think that's really helpful for thinking about Tolkien, actually. And the way that the whole story is really, it's ideological.
Yeah, very much a good versus evil.
With this context in mind, can we talk about where we can see World War I imagery, World War I experience in The Lord of the Rings, even if Tolkien did not intend it? I think it's strongly present.
I think, as we kind of noted, the Dead Marshes are one really, really strong indicator, especially the vastness like it's several days to get over there.
Can you explain the Dead Marshes, Joe?
So the Dead Marshes are these swampy lands that kind of cover this vast territory. They're the remains of a long ago fought battle. There's just bodies of elves, men and orcs strewn all over the place underwater in the swamp. The film sets this in a marsh, and there are these kind of very waxen looking figures just mostly under the water, and Gollum guides Sam and Frodo through the marshes, but gives a warning about not chasing after the lights, whether they're spirits or something like foxfire or fairy fire. But yeah, it's a very horrific place to be, and even the forces of Sauron don't use it. They go around it, which is why they use it as a route to get to Mordor.
I think that it maps really well with how James explained the Battle of the Somme. And I suppose that is because it does seem so clear that this is what's being evoked. One of the only places that Tolkien did acknowledge, okay, yeah, all right, fine, there's some World War I stuff there. I thought it first when Frodo is wounded, he has a sword that goes through his shoulder, and the sword is carried by one of the, I'm going to forget what they're called.
The Nazgûl.
Yeah. And so it's sort of like a cursed sword, and so the wound is worse than a normal sword wound. And Gandalf says that some wounds never heal, and you carry them with you forever. And that, to me, had such a complexity of meaning when you think about veterans of war. And it's not just physical wounds, it's mental wounds. And we see that so much in Frodo at the end of Return of the King when he goes back to the Shire. And he just doesn't feel like he can be there anymore. There's a part of himself that's just never going to be settled at home again. I think also Saruman, who was the White Wizard and was Gandalf's superior, and he goes evil, he turns towards Sauron, and we see him rip up all of the trees in his vicinity. He tears them out of the ground, and he starts this process of industrialization, and he creates Uruk-hai, who are like a warrior species that come from a mix of orcs and goblins. And they come out of the earth. They come out of this muddy earth in this industrialized sort of process. And there's this real, I think there's a lot of World War I stuff going on there as well with industrialized warfare. So the fact that Tolkien took really the first industrialized war in human history, and he reinterprets it where the industrialization is the soldiers themselves. Whether he's I think he would say he was not doing that, but that's that's the reinterpretation that I see.
I think with Frodo in particular is compelling because the films do not have the kind of famous epilogue of the books. That's the scouring of the Shire. So a kind of a broken Saruman rocks up at the Shire. The Ents let him go after they'd been guarding him because they feel pity for him. And he ends up setting like a little industrial fiefdom in the Shire and just causes terror. And the hobbits returning from their journey, they come back, and immediately Merry and Pippin particularly, but also Sam, are suddenly very organised. They've all been, particularly Merry and Pippin, they've been in organised armies. They've seen battle firsthand and immediately slot into leadership roles and organise a little rebellion and overthrow Saruman very swiftly. Frodo is reticent to engage in any violence. He's not really involved in planning, and he's very distant at this point. So the film has to kind of convey that feelings of alienation from the Shire, even in a situation like returning to some kind of conflict, by having Frodo just give an awkward look at a pub. And the others, his comrades, share that as well. They know, and they all kind of sit in silence. But Sam in particular is able to give that hope, like he then takes a step and goes up and marries Rosie in a scene cut rather than, just asking her out or something. But Frodo is unable to re-engage and has to leave.
And I think it happens almost before he realises that it has happened. When we see Frodo in Rivendell and he's recovering from his witchy sword wound, Sam kind of talks him round to, oh yes, he's ready to go back to the Shire, and he seems to be the old Frodo, and he seems to be ready to go back and pick up his life where he left it. But then you have the scene of the council, and Gimli goes and hits the ring with his axe. Frodo kind of flinches and hides from it. He's already become so entangled with the ring that it hurts him to see somebody attempt to destroy the ring. But he doesn't know yet. And I think that has parallel with the experience of trauma in war, where you might at first think you've escaped with your life and phew, you've got out of it and you can go back to your normal life, and maybe already it's just too late to return to the way things were, but you only find that out as you try to get back into normal life. So the trauma affects you before you're aware of it.
Thinking about the First World War and The Lord of the Rings is Peter Jackson went on to make that documentary, the colourised footage from the First World War. That, to me, only really in talking, I was reminded that he did do that. So I'm wondering if this was also something that Peter Jackson, separately from Tolkien's impart to The Lord of the Rings from his own experience, Peter Jackson also is fashioning a narrative that is at least engaging with the war in a way.
Oh, like whether he was thinking about, like he was already interested in the World War I themes before he made Lord of the Rings, and
I don't know.
Or whether Lord of the Rings spurred him on to develop an interest in the First World War. The documentary, in case anyone is interested, is called They Shall Not Grow Old. Peter Jackson took a lot of archival footage from the First World War and he colorized it and he added sound under it. And as a historian, I have thoughts about this, but that would be very off topic. I think sometimes it's hard for creators themselves to even see where they're being impacted. I think this is one of the things I really like about the idea of intertextuality, is that it allows us to explore conversations being had in a text that perhaps the text creator wasn't even necessarily cognizant that they were engaging in. And with something that would be as traumatic and as life-altering as the experience of the Battle of the Somme was for pretty much everybody who participated in it, how could you not be engaging with that, having a conversation with it as you are writing about war and about a conflict between good and evil? And the First World War itself was discussed at the time as a conflict between good and evil. But I wonder, Marion, do you think that we can take this kind of important and deep portrayal of war and the impact of war and take that back into our reading of the biblical text? I feel like sometimes biblical narratives are so far away that we forget sometimes about the humanity of them.
I think much that is in the Hebrew Bible, with the biblical style of writing narrative, it leaves an awful lot unspoken. There's a very famous essay, the author of which I remember in a moment, but the essay is called Odysseus' Scar, and it compares biblical narrative style to Iliad narrative style. And Homeric epic tends to express a lot of things in explicit language, what characters are thinking, what they're feeling, what goes through their mind as they see Odysseus' Scar, for example. And Hebrew Bible is very terse and prefers not to express very much at all. It narrates the bare essentials and leaves the rest for you to work out and for you to wrestle with. And so, to some degree, the biblical texts will give you what you bring to it, in the sense of the degree to which you colour in the emotions that are there, or not there, not expressed there, but which you assume must be felt. And that allows a great deal of flexibility in interpretation, especially recently with feminist interpretations, trans interpretations, all of this sort of stuff. The reason why they have so much scope and so much ability to do amazing readings with the biblical text, is that there are so many gaps there that they can fill in their own way and say, there's nothing to say this reading isn't plausible, there's nothing to say this reading isn't possible. The biblical texts are very much something which only come alive in their reception, and compare that to Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's insistence that he didn't model this on the First World War, regardless of whether or not he modelled it on the First World War. This is a major part of the book's reception. And this is a major part of how people understand the First World War and how people of Tolkien's generation might have felt about experiencing the First World War, whether or not Tolkien wanted to put it in there or consciously put it in there. And to an extent, once you write a text, you release it into the wild, and you don't have the only say on how it's read.
Good answer.
Marion, it's been so great having you with us today, but before we let you go, we'd love for you to pitch us a pairing. This can be anything at all that you would pair with The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring. A drink, a food, another movie, a book, an article, a piece of music. The sky is the limit.
Okay. Well, I watched the Lord of the Rings films when I was still quite young, early teenage years, I think. And of course, the scenery is just stunning. And my family were great walkers. And as a kid, still full of so much imagination, for a long time after seeing them, I couldn't go for a walk anywhere without the Lord of the Rings theme music playing in my head. We were all living in Northumberland at that time, which has very similar scenery. And I think if you want to relive your own little Lord of the Rings quest experience, there was a walk I went on recently, a long distance walk with a friend of mine, which was 5 days walking through the wilderness, essentially. No shops, no roads, nothing. And so everything you had to carry with you. And we went from Blair Athol to Kingussie via Glen Tilt and Glen Feshie, so essentially 2.5 days walking down one glen and 2.5 days walking out another glen. And the scenery was stunning and very similar to Lord of the Rings. And if you need to kind of gird your loins at an inn at the start of the walk, there's the Athol Arms at Blair Athol, which is the prancing pony in real life. And so you can go there, you can have a whole pint and then try this long distance walk with the Lord of the Rings theme music coming through your head.
That's unfortunate for our listeners who are not in the UK.
Come to the UK. Come and do this walk.
Yeah, come visit. So that's what you need to pair with a viewing of The Lord of the Rings, is a visit to the UK. This is really good, Marion. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. It's been great.
That's our show today. Gods and Movie Makers is researched and produced by us, Joe Scales and Katie Turner, and supported by listeners like you. Our music is by Style the Kid. As always, you can follow us at GodMavPod on Twitter and Instagram. If you've enjoyed what you've heard today, head on over to our website, godsandmoviemakers.com, where you can donate to us or subscribe for additional content. Thanks for listening.